Well, everyone, in the interest of squeezing every ounce of valuable time that we can get out of these out of this panel of chefs, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome to our lively discussion session. This is our annual Ask the Chefs panel, in which we recruit writers from the Scholarly Kitchen who happen to be in Charleston to come gather on stage and discuss issues arising. My name is Rick Anderson. I'm the university librarian at Brigham Young University, and I'm one of the writers for the Scholarly Kitchen. I'm joined by Robert Harrington of the American Mathematical Society, Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Judy Luther from Informed Strategies, and Roger Schoenfeld from Ithaca S&R. And what we're going to do is just start with some questions that I will pose to the group, and we'll solicit discussion from them. And then after we've done that for a few minutes, then we'll open it up and let everybody in the room join the conversation. So to begin, oh, and I should tell you, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Scholarly Kitchen, it is the official blog of the Society for Scholarly Publishing. And all of us here are writers commonly called chefs in the kitchen, and over the years we've devised a whole series of groan-inducing puns around the kitchen theme, the most recent of which is our adoption of a new form of blog post that we call a smorgasbord. There was one that went up today, and that's one where we invite chefs who have briefer thoughts than what would normally be expressed in a 1,200 to 2,000 word blog post about current issues to just submit a couple of paragraphs. And the smorgasbord posts are not topically unified. They're just patchwork. You know, there's a pastry here and an open-faced sandwich here, and you get to pick and choose. So. Anyway, with that, I'll open with the first question, and our theme today is the OSTP Memo, about which one or two of you may have heard something over the past few weeks. And I'm going to open it up by asking Robert, what is it that caught your attention when the OSTP Memo, the new one, came out?
Well, thank you, Rick. My first reaction was sort of Monty Python reaction, really. So I literally went, "Well, I never," if anybody knows that reference. Because, you know, it was a little bit, it wasn't really a surprise. I mean, we knew it was coming in some form, but the timing, as Daniel Sepulveda said yesterday, it was the timing that was a little bit of a surprise. Going into after reading the memo, I was struck, really, by how broad it was, how much was in there, and yet it was vague at the same time. So that, you know, and there were various things that were left out, and one key thing that struck me, and you know, I think it's important for us all to consider, is not just the equity of access, but the equity of author choice. And what do the various forms that might then be what the agencies ask their authors, their scientists, their researchers to do in terms of authorship, what does it mean if you are potentially in a position where you don't have funds, or you have very little funding, and then are you going to become a second-class citizen in some way if your choice of where to publish is restricted? Now, I'm not saying these things are not potentially solvable, but it wasn't addressed in that memo. You know, and there was lots of other stuff that wasn't addressed in terms of things like, you know, is there going to be other funding, more funding required? There's a whole host of things in there. There was nothing in about quality. I mean, one thing that was interesting is that the House Science and Technology Committee subsequently sent a letter to the new OSTP director, Arati Prabhakar, with questions such as the ones I just was asking myself when I read the memo. So, you know, yesterday when Daniel Sepulveda was talking, and I think the session was called Plan US, It was a great session, and and it was educational for me in the sense that this is a process. The OSTP makes recommendations, or a mandate, depending on how you want to read that. Those are recommendations not to us, and actually David Crotty wrote a bit about this in a recent article, but not to us as societies or publishers, but to the agencies who will then implement that on behalf of their constituents. But there are many other constituents. There are, for example, the House Science and Technology Committee, who has oversight. There'll be hearings. There'll be consideration of unintended consequences. So, I mean, I guess just to wrap up, because I could go on for hours, but others probably should have a say on this too. I mean, I actually sort of we've actually had some meetings with the National Science Foundation. I've got a meeting next week with the House Science. I don't know exactly who, but some people from the House Science Committee. We have a chance to sort of say our piece about what we think is important. And I personally sense that we'll probably end up with a balance. We understand that open is good, but how we get there may well be open to many different types of interpretation. For us as mathematicians, we don't like article processing charges. We think they're inequitable. We would much rather, we've had green for decades, and it hasn't hurt our subscriptions. I think there will be a balance. I'm not against those who wish to go the gold route, the diamond route. We have a rather wonderful diamond journal sponsored by a donor who was very generous. And then there'll be models around that, whether it be transformational models, whatever. I think there's room for all of that in there, and actually subscriptions too. There's nothing inherently wrong or evil about subscriptions, provided that you have a route to open. So I think probably, and call me, you can turn around and say, well, Robert, you were wrong, weren't you? But probably we'll end up with a balance of all of those things, which I think will then hopefully suit many different stakeholders. But my first reaction was, well, I never.
So, Robert, can I ask a quick follow-up question? You initially said you don't think there's anything wrong with subscriptions, but then you said, I don't think there's anything wrong with subscriptions as long as there's a route to open. Are you saying that you see some degree of subscription access being okay into the indefinite future, or do you see subscription access as being okay as a way station on the way to open?
No, what I meant to say, if I wasn't clear, was that I think subscriptions are absolutely fine in perpetuity. But we all agree, I think. I don't think there's much argument about the idea that moving to open is good. It's just that what I'm trying to say is that the idea of a subscription is all around us. I mean, in all parts of our life. There's nothing inherently wrong with the subscription. What we want are paths to open. So I see all of this in balance for as long as we maintain an ecosystem. I do worry about how libraries will survive in this ecosystem. I worry about how academic societies will survive in this ecosystem. There are plenty of things to worry about, but that balance is what I'm talking about.
Excellent, thanks. Lisa, I think you were struck by some language, or maybe a lack of language, involving metadata and PIDs.
So yeah, we did divide this up because we're all kind of struck by all of it, but I did agree to, in the piece that we did that was sort of the themed post that the chefs reflected on, the OSTP memo in parts 1 and 2, because there were a lot of our reflections, chose to focus on the metadata and permanent identifiers, persistent identifiers component of it. I need to do this with the disclosure that I'm on the board of ORCID, and so I've of course been tracking the persistent identifiers, particularly in that role that I have there. So what's interesting to me about this is that is not actually tied to open. It's not that just open articles should have metadata and persistent identifiers. It's actually a mandate to have a kind of metadata and a kind of persistent identifiers across all of the scholarly publications that emerge from the system of funding research in the federal government. And so I think that can only benefit us for all kinds of things, not the least of which is the open access and the opportunities for joining up different kinds of outputs together, because I know somebody else will talk about the data part in a second. But I think it's really important for us to think about this, particularly because libraries have played a role. Obviously, we are very concerned with metadata and the way that flows into our discovery layers and the like. So we will see improvements in discovery through better metadata happening. We'll also see the kinds of improvements that we will benefit from with linked up persistent identifiers at the article, institution, author, grant funder, et cetera, as this persistent identifier ecosystem is developing and maturing. One of the things that we'll have to grapple with, though, as libraries and institutions, is our responsibility for actually ensuring that our authors from our institutions are prepared to, submit their ORCID with their grant application, with their journal article, manuscript, and the like. And also, I think many of you will be familiar with the problem of we also need to actually do some work probably on our campuses to help authors clean up the fact that they actually have, over the years, acquired multiple ORCIDs. Because they were asked for one when they submitted their grant, and they're like, okay, I follow this, I'll sign up and get one. And then, a year and a half later, they were reviewing a journal manuscript, and the journal said, to do this, we ask you for your ORCID, and they're like, oh, I don't know if I have one of those. Okay, let me sign up and get one. And so, although, for example, ORCID has done does some work to try and say, hey, you actually on this email address already have one of these. Of course, we also know people use different email addresses and all sorts of things. So it will probably fall to librarians as one of the only professions on campus that really understand metadata and identifiers to help an institutional strategy for regularizing, ensuring everyone has an ORCID, has only one ORCID, and also where we're implementing DOIs and the like within our own workflows. So I think that we will both benefit from the collective effort in this area and the mandate across, but it's also going to call to action at our institutions. And honestly, if we probably won't be called to action because no one will think, oh, the library can help with this. So I'm going to rephrase that as a proactive opportunity for us to be reaching out to our grants office, our research office, our publications partners on campus and say, we can help you with this. We understand this already.
I have to confess, I was not aware that ORCID isn't fully able to prevent people from getting multiple ORCIDs, and I'm really struck by the irony of that.
Well, Rick, when you're Rick at Gmail and then you're Rick at Utah and you're Rick at BYU, it's really hard for ORCID to know.
I was trying to remember what the process was when I signed up for an ORCID, and I would have thought that I would have had to provide more identifying information than just my email address. But if that's not the case, that
well, you have to
strikes me as
provide
a weird-
more identifying information than that, but that's different than than ORCID having a mechanism of saying that this graduate student who signed up when they were in their PhD program at NYU is now the same person as this faculty member at the University of Illinois, particularly if they've changed their name in between there.
Sure.
So yes, ORCID does things to try and match things up, but ultimately only the person knows that they use two different email addresses that may not even have their name in them.
Right, yeah, I guess it all depends on how much they ask for, which now I need to, I'd be interested to check that out.
The real issue is now ORCID says, could you please, as institutions, make this happen rather than having everyone go sign up on their own? And in the United States, Lyrasis really gets a shout out as the primary consortium that has helped this develop. Hopefully we'll see additional consortium activity happening in the US as a result of this and the tools that ORCID has to make that happen.
Excellent. Roger, you had some thoughts about open data more generally with regard to the OSTP memo.
Rick, do you have two ORCIDs?
I don't think so. I am morally certain that I've only signed up for one, but
Okay, we're going to fact check that one.
as somebody with one of the more generic names, I really hope that's the case.
So, so one of the things that's so interesting about the new memo is that it's really not just about publications, right? It's also about metadata, as you were pointing out, Lisa. But there's also a huge component of it about research data. And this has gotten much less attention in the discourse around the implications. And yet, I think in some ways stands to be more transformative, because the publishing ecosystem is pretty well developed. The major players, while nothing is fixed forever, are pretty well established. And the mechanisms towards open, while we are innovating new ones, are relatively well developed. And none of that can be said for research data. There are a series of services, none of which are by any means dominant. I don't think we even have a terribly good idea of what their respective market share is relative to one another. There's all sorts of lack of standards in terms of, or even protocol standards may even be too strong of a term, in terms of, what is a scientist just dumping a data set into a repository, or is there actually the curatorial value add that's necessary in order for it to be reused when that original researcher is no longer available to provide assistance? So there are all kinds of questions like that I think the mandate here will, depending on how it is developed, stand to transform. Questions as well about the nature of the research services that universities themselves provide, the data support services that universities themselves provide. And just want to mention my colleague Dylan Rudiger, who's done some really, really interesting work and thinking, and is in the middle of some of this on research data that I think is very interesting. The other piece of this that may be worth highlighting is that the memo is also interesting for not just focusing on the sciences. And so here I won't try to get into the implications of that for publications or metadata, but for research data, there are some very interesting questions about how agencies like NIH or NEA or IMLS may choose to define what it is that is meant by research data in the context of the grants that they are offering. So if you are a historian with NIH funding going to an archives and taking digital photographs of archival records, is that research data? I could see an argument being made in either direction. And so there's a lot of, I think, questions of that sort that are worth paying attention to and thinking about as we see the policy guidance that will, the policy implementation rather, that will come out from some of the agencies.
Excellent, thanks. I want to jump to some implications of the provisions of the OSTP memo for scholarly publishing more generally. I know one concern that has been raised is whether, to the degree that they're rigorously implemented, these provisions might make it harder for smaller independent publishers to continue to do business, or to continue to do business the way they have. And that we might actually see further market consolidation. Judy, I know you've got some thoughts about that.
Yes.
Here, let's. Sorry. There you go.
As I think about the timing of this, it comes kind of on the heels of Plan S. And I think most of the small societies, at least many of the ones I've spoken with, are feeling kind of the pressures of Plan S. I would say whiplash, but the fact that many of the ones that, some of the ones that are independent are in the social sciences. What's happened over a period of time is that the first round, in 2013, when the first mandate came from the U.S. government, it was for the larger agencies. So those were more the sciences, the NSF, the NIH, the DOD.
Anybody who made $100 million or more in grants every year.
Yeah. So that took care of the sciences, and the sciences are better equipped to deal with open access. It's not a new conversation for them. But when you get into the social sciences, now we have a group of people who are subscription-based. I work with societies in the area of business. They're heavily subscription dependent. They don't have research that is funded, certainly not funded with mandates. So their alternative path is transformative agreements, and there aren't that many of those. So where do they go in terms of if they need to pay? Now, the good news is this current mandate isn't requiring full open access with the author having signed a CC BY agreement. It just has to be open content, free to read in that category. So they may have options, but the publishers who have that content in subscriptions will find it hard to sell those subscriptions if indeed that content has to be open, the embargo's eliminated, and that content has to be available from the time that that article is published. So I see an erosion of support potentially for that portion of the market. At least that's a concern that I have. And I think that that will need to be thought through and addressed.
Robert?
I mean, there are several thoughts. I'm just responding to Judy. I am actually just on the point of view, on the point of subscriptions. I don't see an obvious link to the erosion of subscriptions with green. In math, in some ways, and I probably wouldn't say this directly to a mathematician, so hopefully there are none in the room.
It's okay, this isn't being recorded.
Okay, good. That is really good. But we are more like the humanities. I mean, the elegance of the proof, the way in which you write, and it's not the result. It's not a report on data. It's on experiments rather. It's the proof itself that has the intellectual property. That makes it more like history, perhaps.
Right.
And yet we've not seen that issue of immediate green and an erosion of subscriptions. So I don't know, maybe it's just math. We are a little different in some ways, as I'm constantly told by my governments, but you know, how different are we really? Anyway, to get to the point of consolidation, I'm not absolutely sure that this particular memo, the policy, or whatever ends up being the policy, is what will drive consolidation. Consolidation is around us already, driven by any number of factors, be it the larger publishers, engaging in things like partner solutions and things. I think you know what I'm talking about. Or be it the pandemic. I mean, so there are so many reasons why we're facing consolidation. I think the tricky part here is that, like an organization like mine, the American Mathematical Society, you have people like myself. We have Karen Sachs, who's our Associate Executive Director for Government Relations. We are able to get meetings with NSF. We're able to get meetings with the House Science Committee. We're sort of, at least, I'm trying to suggest that I am sophisticated now, but we are sophisticated enough that we can have a conversation. And I've written, for example, something called an open access primer, a 16-page document. I sent that to the NSF program officers. They all read it. And it was a really useful enterprise. We've got that bandwidth. Smaller societies, I think, are struggling on how to go about this. They may be partnered with a larger publisher. They may, at some level, not agree with what their larger publisher is doing. That's a potential problem. And larger publishers are now saying to themselves, well, our smaller society partners are not actually bringing us as much revenue as we would like. Perhaps we are not going to support them as much as we used to. And that's a potential problem. So from a small society perspective, I think there is consolidation, but it's not necessarily going to be related to this other than how to handle policy questions.
Judy, I think you had a follow-up.
Yeah. I have a little more concern about consolidation due to the due to the number of societies who are looking at RFPs to see what vendors can offer them, what the big publishers can offer them in terms of a more stable transition. And the biggest challenge for them is, having been subscription-based, that is prepaid revenue a year in advance, and it's steady. You know what you have coming in for the year. Open access, after the article is accepted, then you bill the author and you get that portion of what might have been part of a subscription payment. So it's much more uncertain environment, and many of these are societies with members. How are they going to continue when their publications have been a solid part of their revenue stream? And if they're in a field where they're having to look internationally for authors who have funding, pretty good in Europe, okay in the US, China. I mean, when it comes to actually reaching out to the author, now you've changed the point of contact from one subscription to 30 articles and how many authors?
Per issue.
Per issue. And that's a lot of communications that they have to make. And guess what? They may not know who those authors are readily in terms of their current affiliation at institutions. The challenge of reaching out to them is pretty overwhelming. The big publishers have a wealth of data and incredible data analytics. They can send out emails to everybody who published in their journals in that area, and then they can send another email to those who hadn't yet published in their journals in that area and invite them, and they'll know whether or not the author had previously had an open access article, and they'd also might know what the impact of that particular article was. So small societies are just, I don't think they're even appreciative yet. They just know, I think they're aware of, or becoming rapidly aware of, that there's a wealth of information that they don't know, and that they're not prepared to manage this on their own. So I'll just tell you that the consultants are getting increasingly busy these days with requests, and some of them are a little concerning, because when you look at their scenario, it may not be enough to interest. What they generate in revenue might not be enough to make them attractive to a big publisher. So trying to find them support and options, because each one of these is a community of scholars. Each one of these represent a portion of the disciplines that are taught at these institutions. So,
and that's a scary scenario. I hadn't really thought about. I think we tend to think in terms of the worst case scenario being, now all journals are just published by 5 publishers because all of these small society journals get subsumed. But there is a potentially worse scenario, and that is that some of these societies simply stop publishing because they're not attractive takeover options for big publishers, and they can't afford to continue doing what they're doing, and there you go. Let's talk for a minute about challenges for libraries. Lisa, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
So I think I already alluded to some of what might be coming our way in the library environment with this kind of shift. Some of it maybe is not tied exclusively to the OSTP memo as causal, but perhaps as catalytic, in the sense that things that were already happening will now start to happen faster as honestly, institutions are also looking for what. So even though we in the library world may or may not have been surprised about the timing, I think it's pretty clear that our offices of research probably were less informed about some of the activities that might have been underway. Some of our campuses may not be surprised, but certainly our scholars on our campus are not watching the OSTP thinking that a memo was forthcoming that was going to change their lives, particularly if they were not already in the NSF, NIH world. Myself, even having grants from IMLS, which is $250,000, is still quite large in comparison to some of my colleagues that have grants from very small federal agencies. So I think one of the biggest things I want to start, though, is I like this Plan US on the heels of Plan S. That's very good. What we can see as far as publisher reaction to Plan S can help us predict what publisher reaction is going to be to Plan US. And although, Robert, you sort of say, like, green OA has been okay for you, I'm very curious the actual uptake of the green OA among your community, because this is one of the challenges that we're now seeing, is that Plan S has put in place infrastructures that drive green OA zero embargo uptake. So a publisher having the policy that allows green OA might have no impact if none of their authors actually take advantage of it. Right?
Or even if half of them do. But having a policy that you allow something doesn't create the thing happening. Other things have to be put in place that actually catalyze the activity. And so
In the United States, under the 2013 memo, libraries by and large did not put infrastructures in place that facilitated 6 to 12-month embargo repositing. In fact, we were, I think we've benefited immensely from Chorus and the publisher activities that have essentially allowed us to trust that it's happening. Because authors, through their publication agreements, the publisher has said, we have a 12-month embargo, we have a 16, whatever it is, and through the agreements with Chorus and the federal agencies that have these policies, they've worked it out, and it just happens. From our perspective as librarians, I know from the publishers in the room, you're doing like a lot of work to make it happen. I know it's not magical. So a publisher doesn't have to do that, though. And they certainly don't have to facilitate a zero embargo green OA rather than an embargoed VOR deposit, version of record deposit, which is what they're currently primarily doing. So we are actually potentially facing a situation in which the infrastructures that have been put in place that we have relied upon will begin to crumble. Because we've relied on the publishers who have said, okay, we'll accept an embargo, and then we'll facilitate, that's been the quid pro quo. If under a zero embargo, they don't quid pro quo with us, I am not confident that our libraries have really quite figured out what we're going to do then in 2024, 2025, whatever it is, when our institutions will be recognizing that the institution has an obligation. Right? Because the institution has been able to rely on the publishers actually making sure that we're meeting our obligation to a certain degree. Because it's really an obligation on the institution as the recipient of the grant funding. So, what are our institutions going to do as far as facilitating, if we go with the green mandate, facilitating green deposit? Because it won't be in our institutional repositories, it has to be in the repositories the agencies have laid out. So what we can quickly imagine as well from Plan S and the rights retention strategy, which is essentially a zero embargo green policy as well, we know that a number of the publishers have said, we will be happy for you to have a zero embargo green, and the way you get that is you pay for gold version of record. So I have called this, in a piece that's not yet published, but on Twitter, green via gold. So you will get your green OA by paying for gold, at which
Sort of
point...
a chartreuse sound.
Yeah. I am not introducing another caller. I'm already in trouble for introducing this concept of mechanism. I'm sorry, it's like a lot to unpack here, but these are really big dynamics, and we already know what number of publishers have done in response to Plan S. So in some ways, we're in a really good position to be like, well, it seems like likely they're going to change their mind with a greater threat of zero embargo. If anything, they're probably going to double down on that. I mean, maybe not Robert, but a lot of the others, and the big ones, where our people want to publish, and where the mandate's going to hit sooner. So I think what that ultimately means is in the library, we are going to be under institutional pressure to do transformative agreements, which by and large we have, with some small exceptions, or some exceptions, California Digital Library being the most obvious. I know Iowa State's done a number, but if you look at the registry of transformative agreements, very few have been done in the United States. We'll be under incredible pressure to do them because of what Judy has been talking about, of all our authors who are now going to be under this mandate, where their journals will not have a mechanism, and the mechanism will be to pay the APC. And as a management task, we want to do that through contracts. We don't want to do this through individual invoices. So we're going to be under pressure to strike transformative agreements and peer publish agreements by our institutions. And so all I can say is I would recommend starting those conversations with your provost and your vice chancellor for research yesterday.
And I know Robert's got a follow-up if we could pass the mic down. In the meantime, I want to touch on something that you just said, Lisa. You hit on a point just briefly that I think is really important. A lot of our colleagues in libraries, I think, look at the new OSTP memo and say, great, there are going to be these mandates to deposit your papers in repositories. And we think that what that means is our institutional repositories. I would be very surprised if the funding agencies say, put your papers in your local institutional repository. They're going to say, put them in BMJ, put them in, well-established, well-known disciplinary repository X, Y, and Z, and that's going to be a sad day, I think, for a lot of IR managers. Robert, you were going to follow up.
Oh, just on a couple of things. I mean, I honestly, I think that we need to be sensitive to different cultures. And so when it comes to transformative arrangements, essentially, mostly, not all actually, based on article processing charges, I think there are real issues around equity. Having said that, I think there's room for all of these models, including, subscribe to open, a number of models that will. So I'm not sure, Lisa, that I agree with you. As usual, I disagree with you, but respectfully, of course.
So you think the provost is going to be looking for us to solve this problem for them?
I'm not sure, but I'm just suggesting that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And then the other question you mentioned is about sort of take-up of the green. I just don't want to focus really only on green, but for us and for the wonderful world of math and computer science and physics, the archive is very much a part of the ecosystem. And I would say the majority of our authors view the archive as an essential part of their world. And pretty much, I'm not going to say all, but pretty much most of our authors will post on the archive as a part of the green route. And so the answer is yes, we do.
Just to clarify, they're posting a preprint or an author-accepted manuscript?
The peer-reviewed, author-accepted manuscript.
Yeah, Roger, I think you had some thoughts about infrastructure and compliance.
Yeah, but I think I'll enter this discussion a little bit by just pointing out that as Lisa articulated, that this is a mandate on institutions who have received grants, right? That is the compliance mechanism, and the compliance for grant compliance does not take place in the library. It may be that in this case institutions will look to the library. I think there's also a scenario where institutions will say, wait, who lobbied for this? Why did we end up with this what is actually an unfunded mandate, and from the university's perspective? And I want to unpack that for just a moment. So if you are the senior research officer who will now have another compliance element, not to say it's the worst one or a bad one or anything like that, but one more on the list. The easiest way to comply with it is to require all of your federal grantees to have an APC as part of all of your federal grants to include budget for APCs. That's the easiest way to do it. You go through every grant application and you check the budget and you see, is there funding for APCs? If there is, you let it go to NSF, NIH, et cetera. If there isn't, you go back to the PI and you say, make sure you put that in, right? There's a very easy gating function there. And a funded gating function, by the way, that doesn't require any new labor, any additional processes, new workflows, nothing. If you instead say, oh, this green thing, that's really interesting. Let's not request APCs. Let's ensure compliance with green. There's an enormous workflow there that actually isn't federally funded, as far as I can see, won't be federally funded. You will have to put in place new processes, new infrastructure, new workflows.
Hire people.
Hire human beings with benefits and all of those kinds of things to do that work. Not to say that that's bad. It might be the less expensive option for the system, right? but not the less expensive option for the senior research officer who has a budget to manage. And I think that we're like, we need to, when we say follow the money, it's at that level of who makes the decisions and where, how do those things work. So I want to, and when you think about it as a compliance issue, all you have to do is, and that's where I'm not so sure about the transformative agreement piece of this, right? There is a scenario where institutions will say, great, well, since X percentage of our research, which is federally funded, needs to go open, let's sign transformative agreements to make sure everything can be open. But that's money out of the pocket of the institution. If there's new costs to that, that's money coming out of the pocket of the institution. And I think it'll be very interesting to see which universities choose to universalize this mandate and which say, if the funder isn't providing an APC, we don't have to comply with that. There is no compliance. So I'm not sure how that's going to play itself out. I think it will be, interesting to see how that develops.
So the only thing I'd add to that is I don't think that the grants office saying, and I mean, having grants, I can tell you, my grant application is not going in if the campus does not sign off on the budget. Right? So if I put in that I'm going to pay people X dollars and that's not the rate the campus pays people,
They kick it back.
they kick it back,
Yeah.
right? So I think that there's a scenario in which they could say that, but that is not equal then to each person is managing that as an invoice to their lab. So, we're in a hypothetical world very much here at this point, but it is possible that the institution would sequester those funds in a certain way and still seek the efficiencies of managing this through a contract. And then part of the question will be like, well, then who in the institution is managing that contract? But, looking at the hundreds of articles my institution is publishing with certain large publishers, or even some medium-sized publishers where we have like an incredible amount of research activity, I am pretty confident they do not want to manage paying those invoices an article at a time. So it's like a yes and, or a yes and another question. But I think it's absolutely the case that our institutions will treat this as a compliance mandate, not as an equity concern, for example. So they will be less concerned about whether the mechanism they choose creates disadvantage for other folks than whether it creates compliance for the institution so that the dollars keep funding, that keep the research going.
Our institutions care, I think, generally very much in a sincere but abstract and generalized way about global equity.
Yes.
And care very concretely and specifically about compliance and serving their immediate constituents. And when those two things come into tension, that
They are always in tension.
Yeah, they're always in tension. Anytime you're dealing with limited resources, those two things are going to be in tension. So we have about 16 minutes left in the session, so I think this might be a good time for us to open it up to the floor. We have one mic. Because we are in fact recording this, please wait to make your comment until the mic finds its way to you, and I apologize, it's kind of a big room. Here, and then here, and then here, and then there, and there.
Hi, Ros Pine from Bloomsbury Academic. I wanted to ask the panel's thoughts on how the OSTP memo might affect books and book chapters, particularly in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. That's an area where open access routes are less well developed, both gold and green, where publishing models are more precarious, and where the relevant agencies don't have any existing policies from which we might extrapolate. And even Plan S hasn't yet put in place a hard mandate for those. And I also note that the list of organisations that were consulted in the run-up to this is conspicuously lacking in any arts and humanities organisations, and that the memo mentions book chapters but not books. So what's going on?
Good question.
This has been mentioned by others.
I may jump in on that. I'll also point out not only the list of organizations that were consulted, but also it is the Office of Science and Technology Policy that is purporting to make policy, in this case for the humanities as well. So I think that's actually quite interesting in terms of the orientation of that office and the priorities that it incorporates. My sense from what I see is I'll expect some kind of book processing charge or the equivalent of that to be funded by the humanities publishers. Article, chapter processing, that's...
By the publishers?
By the, sorry, did I say by the publishers?
Yeah.
By the funders, excuse me. Thank you. And I think that the number of articles and books that are actually in question from the humanities funders, not to say the science funders, by the humanities funders, is vanishingly small as a percentage of actual humanistic arts, et cetera, publishing. So I don't think it's going to meaningfully change the marketplace. I think there is a higher likelihood of some marketplace level changes as my fellow panelists were talking about in the sciences. I just don't see the activity as a share of the total being high enough in the humanities and arts, the funding to be substantial enough to change the marketplace.
Robert, you had some comments?
I mean, I think you bring up a really important point. As a society in math, we publish, well, supposedly around 85 books a year. Is a bit dropped actually after the pandemic. It wasn't at the top of the list of priorities, I think. But for us, you know, it was a really good session this morning from a number of university presses, I think, chaired by, sorry, I've forgotten her name, from Lyrasis, and Charlotte from Lyrasis, thank you, sorry. And I really do think we have to grapple with that. We have books. The one theme that we want to engage with is that we do not want to put any burden on authors, on researchers, as they. So I really am not a fan of the book processing charge, and I know we've talked about this in the past. I want, you know, on the other hand, what models are there out there that would suit us, not affiliated with an institution? We haven't worked it out. We're a bit behind the curve, I think, on that. I do think it's, you know, important for us to go there next and engage with that community. So I have it on the list of things. It's just this OSTP memo is sort of so, you know, on top of me from a journal's perspective. The books piece is going to come next, I think.
I was talking with someone about how I really did not envy the Charleston Conference planners when the OSTP memo came out a month before this meeting, when the program had presumably already been set. Who's got the mic next?
Gaëlle Becquet. I'm the director of the ISSN International Center in Paris, France. I'm very surprised, you know, not to hear that there are other models for scholarly publishing that exist, namely, for example, the Latin American model. And I think it would be also nice, you know, to look over the border down south, or maybe up north. Have a look, you know, at what our colleagues from Canada are also doing. There are many articles which have been published on the costs of APCs and precising or specifying the fact that they are largely too expensive compared to, you know, the real cost of article publishing, at least. So I think it's maybe time for a sea change on how scholarly, I mean, the research, the scholarly output is actually shared with, you know, the constituencies. Thank you.
Thoughts on that? Thoughts on pricing of APCs and other structural issues? There you go.
So I think that, I mean, I think we can agree with such a statement that there are other models. I think there's no indication in the OSTP memo that the US government is intending to sort of spin up some Latin American equivalent funding of institutions to publish journals in a diamond way so that our authors have output. So, I mean, I don't disagree that those models exist, but there's no signs, as far as I can see within the OSTP memo, that that is a path that that the office or that the congressional leaders who put their letter forward are asking for. So the question of like the the cost of an APC, I think that will come back to our institutions to figure out how can we comply at a lower possible cost. But that is not something I can imagine being managed by the federal government.
My name is Jai Bhatt. I am the engineering librarian at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And my question comes because our faculty members publish in number of...
Can you put that mic really close to your mouth? Thanks.
No, it's on. It just needs to be closer to you.
Tip it towards you.
Okay. Our researchers publish papers in number of societies like ACS, IOP, IEEE, ACM. So when you're thinking about transformative agreements for each of those societies, how can institutions afford paying thousands of dollars for multiple transformative agreements? That is one issue. And the second is what happens to intellectual property, patents, inventions. There's so many technology transfer initiatives are happening through our campus initiatives. And they do publish papers. So what happens to those if they have to put those in open access platform? So there are two questions.
I'll say I do think that the question of the question of how will institutions afford the additional costs that might come with transformative agreements is a very important one, and I think it's a question that has the potential to mitigate the pressure that Lisa was talking about. If the institution says, gosh, you guys, it sounds like we need to move in the direction of a transformative agreement, and we say, yeah, that sounds great, just give us an extra X $100,000 per year, and we can do that, the conversation might not end there. It might continue, and of course, the shape that would take would vary very much from institution to institution, but you're, yeah, anything else to add on that? Robert?
I clearly can't speak on behalf of libraries, but one thing I can say is that it seems like through this process, this governmental process, that the House Science and Technology Committee will consider what the unintended consequences may be, and that those consequences, that's up to us to bring those potential consequences to the table, such as the things that you talk about. And I don't know what's going to happen with funding, but I know that that was on the list of questions in the letter from Congress to OSTP. And that's not an answer to your question, but I think it fits into this label of unintended consequences.
I think the mic, oh, sorry, Roger.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on the second part of your question. You mentioned
yeah,
technology transfer, I believe, and I think that, I think I'm so happy that you've picked up on the complexity of aligning policy around open access with other kinds of considerations around intellectual property, technology transfer, export control, et cetera. I would point out that at the very same time that in one wing of the White House complex, OSTP was working on a memo about open access, at the very same time, there were other offices in the White House that were working to cut off access to China to advanced technologies. And I think that one of the things that will be very interesting to see is how those two, it's a different kind of tension than the one you were pointing to, but how those two policies, which are they're inconsistent with one another, how that will get resolved. Now, there's some amount of, well, we can live with some of the inconsistency, and that's okay. The world is a complicated place. But it's almost inevitable that one, if not both houses of Congress are about to change hands. And at that point, we're going to see how the House Science and Technology Committee, Senate committees, et cetera, choose to engage with that kind of inconsistency. And I'm not sure that we've heard the last word on how that tension will get resolved. So I appreciate you raising that question. Thank you.
That's a great point. The mic is now somewhere else.
Lev Rickards, Santa Clara University. We're a medium-sized, but probably primarily a read institution, and we really benefit from our consortium, SCELC, which has been doing great work, striking transformative agreements for us. So we're starting to dip our toe into this, but it's really at the consortial level. It's not us doing it. I've sort of seen two paths. One is we can work with our consortium to get these transformative agreements, and then everything you've described gets handled. The other path I've seen is we're uncomfortable with transformative agreements as basically reifying the big deal. Maybe we want to unbundle to drive down costs. Do I understand from your comments that if we unbundle to drive down costs, our institution, to the extent that we're benefiting from any funding at all, is going to have to take on the work of figuring out depositing these copies because we haven't struck an APC included deal?
I don't think that's quite exactly right, but generally true. So I would say the issue is your institutional researchers will be under the mandate that whatever is what their agency says, right? So we still don't know what the actual agency policies are. The institution will have agreed to this compliance in taking the money. And so there will need to be at the institution level some way that they can be like, yes, we have complied in some way. So the question will be, given that we will probably see continuation of author choice in where they publish, right? The authors are going to begin to run into cases where they will not be able to take the green OA zero embargo route unless they pay an APC. So either your institution will have a transformative agreement, and so they can flow into that for that, or they will need a mechanism for paying an APC because the only route to zero embargo green is via gold. So now some publishers, it turns out if they're publishing with Robert, you're going to be fine because they can just publish closed. They can comply on the archive probably or some other thing. It's going to be fine. The publishers that are saying no to the rights retention strategy cover an awful lot of the market.
Yeah, maybe not an awful lot of the revenue in the market, but an awful lot of the articles in the market. And the distinction between those two things is often elided in conversations about the nature of that market.
Over here.
Back there.
So coming back to the question of data, in the context of both compliance and institutional support services, and indeed the publisher's role in open data, I'm curious if the panel has any thoughts on the NIH plan that's requiring data, scientific data to be shared by time of grant closeout or first publication, and how that might interface with the memo, as well as pushing the institution into developing some of this infrastructure in the larger community as well.
So, I mean, in some ways, I think the NIH policy is the kind of policy we're expecting to see from the other groups, because when the OSTP memo says the data should be shared even before publication, I mean, at some point an agency is going to have to say, and here's what we mean by that. So by grant closeout or time of first publication, there may be some other criteria that are used. They can't possibly mean the moment the data is created, it's public, right? Because we understand the need to process and that sort of thing. So what that tells us is we can sort of look and say that's probably the kind of thing we're going to see. I know that it has caused a fair amount of flurry among data librarians. It is not even entirely clear yet what compliance will look like, is my understanding. It certainly is not that there is a funding stream for it as institutions seek to comply with this. But obviously, when you've taken the money, you've got the compliance. I do think the other thing we should remember from the 2013 memo is that it is not the case that all authors are already compliant with the 2013 memo. And so part of what remains to be seen is actually agency ability to monitor compliance, to do anything about compliance. So there's a lot of, I don't want to say that institutions will be looking for that as a loophole, but I can say that I expect that we'll at least have a transition period of amnesty and grace, which is probably good, because I don't think we're ready for the data part. We are less ready for the data part than we are for the OA part.
And I think even where authors and institutions may not have the intention to be non-compliant, there will be varying levels of awareness among authors, and the idea that every funding agency, every time they get a grant application in the future, is going to stop and say, okay, have we given money to this author, to this PI before, and let's find out whether they complied with all of our recommendations or with all of our requirements. The idea that that's going to happen with every grant application in every agency is maybe a little optimistic. And so there may be grace and amnesty, and there also may just be sloppiness. Both of which have the same effect.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that that a little bit more of the checking will be at the institution level rather than the PI level.
Yeah. That's true too.
Yeah. But that is obviously not what anyone is going for, and that would be a dangerous strategy to assume that if you just don't pay any attention, it'll go away.
No, and like I said, I doubt that would be anybody's strategy, but I could imagine that being an unintentional practice.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reality is that it is actually impossible to comply with a 0-day embargo, or no embargo, a green OA, once you've failed to do it. Right? You can only have a reparative. So once somebody's like, hey, you should have deposited that manuscript a year ago.
They don't become compliant when a year later they do
They will actually show up in the audits as compliant because none of our OA data currently has any timestamps on it. So we don't actually know when anything became OA. We just know that it is now OA, which thanks to Neural, we've now got a whole bunch of OA content from the 80s that was showing up closed 6 months ago. So, there's a lot of complexity here.
Yeah. We are out of time. So thank you so much to all of you who came. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
And our moderator.
And please join our ongoing conversation in the Scholarly Kitchen. Thank you.